My name is Simone Okafor. I am 29 years old. And the Thanksgiving my uncle stood at the head of the table and told the room that my salary belonged to all of us was the night I understood that a family's definition of generosity is often just someone else's labor with a different name on it. He said it before the food was even served. In this family, we pool. He said it looking at me, which told me the statement had been prepared. My father, sitting 2 seats down, nodded once without meeting my eyes. My mother, beside him, added, "Your grandmother would be ashamed of how separate you've become." My grandmother was at the far end of the table, 83 years old, and she had not, as far as I could tell, said anything about shame at all. I pressed my napkin against the table edge. I stood. I walked to the far end of the table, bent down, and kissed my grandmother's cheek. She smelled like the perfume she had worn my entire life, something soft and powdery that I've never been able to name. I told her it was good to see her. Then I straightened up, wished the table a good night, got my coat from the hook by the front door, and drove home. What none of them knew, not my uncle, not my father, not my mother who had invoked my grandmother's shame as though it were something she had standing to transfer, was that I had gone to the bank 11 days earlier and removed my name as authorized signer on the family's joint account. The account I had been managing, funding the shortfalls in and fielding calls about since 2019. The account whose January statement, when it arrived, would show 3 balances that no one in that room had the standing or the access to address. I drove home on empty roads. The holiday traffic had already settled. I made tea, sat at my kitchen table, and thought about the word pool. I want to tell you what pooling actually looked like in my family because I think the word gets used as though it means something equal, something mutual, something that flows in both directions. In our family, it flowed in one. My family is Nigerian on both sides. My parents came here separately, met through a mutual friend from their hometown, and built a life that was organized around the expectation that family resources were never entirely private. This is not unusual in their community, and I want to be honest that I understood the framework and did not always object to it. What I objected to over time was the way the framework had calcified into a system with one primary input and many extraction points, and the way that system had been given a name, family, as though the name made it reciprocal. My father, Clement, is 61. He worked for 28 years as an electrician for a commercial contractor, a career that had required physical effort and skill and had provided a steady income and a pension he would begin drawing in 4 years. My mother, Adiz, ran a small catering business from our home kitchen for most of my childhood, a business that had been genuinely profitable in its peak years and had wound down when my younger brother was born and the logistics became difficult. She still took occasional contracts, a wedding here, a corporate lunch there, but the business was no longer a primary income source. My uncle Chisholm, my father's older brother, had come to this country 12 years after my parents and had settled in the same city, which meant that the extended family network was geographically dense in a way that made the pooling framework feel natural and also inescapable. Chisholm had worked in property management, had invested in 2 rental units during a period when the market made that feasible, and had retired early on the income from those units, which provided him with a comfortable, if not extravagant life and a great deal of time to develop opinions about how other people's money should be managed. I was the first person in the immediate family to finish a 4-year degree and enter a professional career track. I graduated from a state university with a 3.6 GPA in accounting and passed the CPA examination on my first attempt at 23, which my parents celebrated with a dinner that was the last time I remember the family talking about my professional accomplishments as something that had cost something to achieve. After that, the accomplishments became assumptions. I joined the audit practice at a regional accounting firm called Halverson and Trent Associates 2 months after passing the CPA exam. Starting salary was $58,000. I was 23. Within 18 months, I had been assigned to the firm's largest client, a regional hospital network whose audit required coordinating with a team of 6, and by the time I was 25, I had been promoted to senior associate with a salary of $74,000 and a performance bonus structure that added between $6,000 and $11,000 in a good year. I lived carefully. I kept my rent low by taking a 1-bedroom apartment that was small enough to make some of my colleagues raise their eyebrows when they visited, paid off my student loans in 27 months, and moved money into savings every pay period before I spent anything else. By 26, I had $34,000 in a savings account and a Roth IRA I contributed the annual maximum to every year. The family knew, in the general way that families know things, that I was doing well. They had the category: she works in accounting, she passed the CPA, she has a good job, without the specific content of what that meant in dollars or in the particular discipline it had required. What they had decided from the category was that I had surplus, and that surplus in the family framework was available. The first time the pooling was made explicit to me, not implied, not ambient, but stated, was in 2019, when my Uncle Chisholm convened what he called a family financial meeting at my parents' house. I want to be precise about what that meeting was because it was dressed as a conversation and was actually a presentation. Chisholm had prepared a document. It was 3 pages, printed and stapled, with a heading that said Family Resource Coordination and a date. It outlined the family's collective financial picture: my parents' income and expenses, Chisholm's rental income and expenses, a brief note about my younger brother Tabena's situation. He was 22 and working a warehouse job while taking night classes, and a section at the end that outlined proposed contributions from each family member to a joint account that would serve as a collective emergency fund and resource pool. My proposed contribution was $800 a month. I sat at my parents' kitchen table and read the document twice. Then I looked at Chisholm, who was watching me read it, and I said, "Who else is contributing?" He said my parents would contribute $300 a month combined from my father's income. He said his own rental income would make him the account's beneficiary rather than a contributor, on the theory that the account was a safety net and he already had one. He said Tabena, given his circumstances, would contribute when he was able. I said, "So, I'm the primary contributor." He said, "You have the most to give." I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I went back and forth, genuinely, because I was not opposed to the concept of a family resource pool in principle, and because I understood that my parents' financial situation was real and that Tabena's was precarious. What I was opposed to was the architecture, the way my contribution had been named first and largest, the way Chisholm's exemption had been framed as logical, the way "you have the most to give" had been said as a conclusion rather than a conversation. I said yes to a contribution of $500 a month, not $800. Chisholm said that was a start. I opened the joint account at my bank, named myself as the authorized signer, and set up the automatic transfer. For 5 years, I was the authorized signer on that account. I want to explain what that meant in practice because it meant more than the monthly transfer. It meant I was the one the bank called when the account needed a document, when a transaction was flagged, when the debit card attached to the account was declined and someone needed to sort it out. It meant I was the one who managed the account's balance, who made judgment calls about whether a withdrawal my father had made was appropriate given the current balance, who fielded calls from my mother when she needed to know if there was enough in the account to cover a specific expense. It also meant that over 5 years, the account had become something different from what Chisholm's 3-page document had described. The $500 monthly transfer had been consistent. The other contributions had not. My father transferred money when his cash flow was comfortable and skipped months when it wasn't. Tabena had contributed twice in 5 years, 2 transfers of $200 each, and had stopped when his night class schedule intensified. Chisholm had, in the second year, begun making occasional withdrawals on the theory that his rental property had experienced a maintenance expense, and the family pool was exactly the kind of resource that existed for such situations. By the 4th year, I was the account's effective sole funder. I did not raise this directly, not because I did not notice it, but because I had not yet found the version of the conversation that felt worth having. I mentioned it once to my father, obliquely, in a phone call about something else. He said that these things ebbed and flowed, and that the important thing was that the family had a resource. I said yes and did not mention it again. What I did, instead, was keep records. This is my professional training at work, and I do not think I was being strategic at the time. I kept records because keeping records is how I move through the world, the same way a carpenter measures twice, not because they distrust the wood, but because precision is a habit. I had a spreadsheet that tracked every transaction in the joint account: date, amount, direction, initiating party. By November of the 5th year, The spreadsheet showed that I had contributed $31,200 to the account over 60 months. It showed that my father had contributed $9,800. It showed that Tabena had contributed $400. It showed that Chisholm had contributed $0 and had withdrawn $4,700 over the same period for what he had described in text messages I had saved as maintenance, a temporary shortfall on one of his properties, and a family travel expense that he had characterized as benefiting everyone. I was not angry when I looked at those numbers. I want to be accurate about that. What I was looking at the spreadsheet on a Tuesday evening in the week before Thanksgiving was clear. The clarity was not a feeling. It was more like what happens when you have been looking at something blurry for a long time, and then you put on the right glasses and the thing comes into focus all at once, and you understand that the blur was never about the object, it was about the instrument. I went to the bank that Thursday. I told the branch manager, a calm and efficient woman named Sandra Howell, that I wanted to remove myself as the authorized signer on the joint account and convert my access to read-only for 30 days before terminating it entirely. She walked me through the process. It took 40 minutes. I signed where she indicated, received confirmation copies, and left. I did not transfer the $500 that month. I went to Thanksgiving 11 days later. The thing I have thought about most in the month since is not the dinner itself, but the quality of my uncle's voice when he said it. In this family, we pool. He said it the way people say things they believe are uncontested truths. Not defensively, not aggressively, but with the calm certainty of a person who has never had the statement examined. He believed it. That is the important thing to understand. He was not trying to take something from me with the conscious intention that a person has when they are being dishonest. He had built a framework that served him, had given it a name that made it sound collective, and had believed in it long enough that the belief had become indistinguishable from fact. The fact that the framework served him primarily was something he had arranged not to see. My father had arranged not to see it too, which was in some ways more painful to understand, because my father was not a careless person. He was a man who had worked with his hands for 28 years and had paid his obligations and had raised 2 children in a country that had not been designed for his success. His version of the arrangement was that it kept the family together, and keeping the family together was, for him, a value that overrode the specific mechanics of who was doing what. He had not examined the mechanics. Examining them would have required admitting something he was not ready to admit. My mother had invoked my grandmother's shame, which was the cruelest instrument available to her and which she had reached for the way people reach for the sharpest thing when they feel a situation slipping. My grandmother had not said anything about shame. My grandmother, when I had kissed her cheek at the end of the table, had held my hand for a moment, just a moment, the briefest pressure, and had not let go until I straightened up. I do not know what that meant. I have thought about it many times. I drove home. I made tea. I sat with the spreadsheet open on my laptop and looked at it for a while, not because I needed to look at it again, but because I wanted to be certain one more time that I was doing something proportionate and not something reactive. It was proportionate. January arrived in the way January always arrives, without ceremony, with the particular flatness of a month that exists primarily to settle accounts. The joint account statement generated on the 4th. The balance was $2,340, which was what remained from the previous month's transactions minus Chisholm's last withdrawal, which had been in October. There was no deposit in December. My $500 transfer, which had been automatic for 60 months, had not gone through because I was no longer an authorized signer, and the transfer had been linked to that status. My father called on the 6th. He said the statement had come, and he wanted to understand what had happened to the automatic transfer. I said, I removed myself from the account in November. The transfer was linked to my authorized signer status. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You removed yourself. I said, Yes. He said, Without telling anyone. I said, I told the bank. He said, Simone. I said, Dad, I want to have a real conversation about this, but I'd like to do it properly. Can we find a time this week? He said yes, in the careful way of someone who was already running calculations he had not finished. My uncle called 2 days later. His call was longer and less careful. He said that the account had obligations and that removing myself without notice was irresponsible. I said I understood his concern. He said the family had been counting on those contributions. I said I understood that too. He said that this was exactly the kind of self-centered behavior that weakened a family structure. I said I would be happy to discuss the structure when we could sit down together, and that I had some information I thought would be useful for that conversation. He asked what information. I said I would bring it when we met. We met on a Saturday in the second week of January at my parents' house. My father had arranged it. My uncle was there and my mother and Tabena, who had been told to come and had shown up looking like a man who had been pulled into something he did not fully understand. I brought a folder. Inside it was a printout of the spreadsheet, not the full 60 months, but a summary page I had prepared. Total contributions by person, total withdrawals by person, net position for each account member over the life of the account. I had formatted it the way I would format a client deliverable, clean, labeled, with a date range across the top and a total row at the bottom. I set it in the center of the table. My uncle reached for it first. He read the top line, his name, 0 contributions for $1,700 in withdrawals, and his hand went still on the edge of the paper. My father picked up the second copy I had brought. He read it slowly, the way he read things he was prepared to disagree with. He got to the bottom row. He set it down. My mother was looking at the table. Tabena, who had been the least implicated person in the room, was looking at the window. No one said anything for long enough that the refrigerator's compressor kicked on, and I could hear it clearly. My uncle said, "These numbers aren't right." I said, "They're sourced from the bank statements. I have 60 months of statements in this folder, if you'd like to go through them." He said, "I made contributions." I said, "The account records show 2 contributions from your name, both in the first year, totaling $600. After that, the account records show 6 withdrawals from your name over 4 years, totaling $4,700. I can show you each transaction." He said, "The maintenance expenses." I said, "Were your expenses on your property?" He said nothing. My father said quietly, "How much have you put in total?" I said, $31,200. Over 5 years. My father set both hands flat on the table. He looked at them. My mother said, "Why didn't you say something?" I said something once, to Dad, 2 years ago. He told me these things ebb and flow. I looked at my father when I said it. Not to wound him, I want to be accurate about that, but because it was true and it needed to be in the room. My father did not look up. I said, "I'm not here to go backward. I'm here because I think the arrangement needs to change and because I think everyone in this room now has the same information, which is the only place you can start a real conversation from." My uncle said, "And what does changing it look like?" I said, "It looks like everyone who participates on terms that are explicit and agreed to, not assumed, not inherited from a document prepared in 2019 that only one person read carefully. Agreed to by everyone, with numbers attached." My uncle said, "And if we can't agree?" I said, "Then I'm not in the account." The room was quiet again. The refrigerator compressor had stopped. Outside, a car went past. My father looked up. He said, "You'd walk away from the family." I said, "I'd walk away from an arrangement that costs me $31,200 over 5 years and costs the other primary beneficiary nothing. That's not walking away from the family. That's walking away from a bad contract." He looked at the spreadsheet again. His hands were still flat on the table. He said, "I didn't know it had gone that far." I said, "I know." What happened after that meeting was not a single dramatic resolution. I want to be honest about that because the honest version is more useful than the clean one. My uncle was quiet for most of that month. He did not call me. He did not, as far as I knew, contact my father about the account. What he did, which I learned from my father in February, was have a conversation with his wife about the rental properties and what the maintenance reserves on those properties actually looked like. His wife, a woman named Adana, whom I had always found more precise than her husband, had apparently asked a question about the family account that Chisholm had not been able to answer to her satisfaction. I do not know the details of that conversation. I know only that it happened and that it seemed to have had an effect. My father called me in the third week of January. He said he had been thinking about the meeting and about the spreadsheet and about the conversation I had mentioned, the one where he had told me these things ebbed and flowed. He said he wished he had listened more carefully. He said it plainly, without the scaffolding people sometimes build around an admission to make it easier to say, and I accepted it the same way. We talked about what a new arrangement might look like. My father proposed a smaller account, a true emergency fund, not a general resource pool, with a fixed contribution from each member that reflected what each person could actually sustain, and with quarterly statements shared among all contributors. He said he would talk to Chisholm about what contribution from Chisholm would be appropriate given his rental income. I said that was a reasonable starting point. I said I would consider participating in a new arrangement on those terms. I was not yet certain. I told him so. Tabena came to my apartment in February unannounced, which was unusual enough that I opened the door with some wariness. He sat at my kitchen counter and said, without preamble, that he had not understood the scope of what had been happening with the account, and that if he had understood it sooner, he would have made a different choice about his own contributions. He was 26. He was 3 semesters from finishing his degree. He had a steady job and was, as far as I could tell, managing his own finances with the careful attention of someone who had grown up watching money be a source of difficulty and had decided to approach it differently. He said, I should have asked more questions. I said, you were in it too. It's hard to ask questions about something you're inside. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to decide what I can agree to and agree to that. Nothing more. He said, that sounds right. We ate the leftover rice I heated up and watched the end of something on television and did not talk about the account again that evening. It was the most comfortable I had felt in my family in a long time, which told me something about how much of the discomfort had been coming from the arrangement and not from the people. By March, I was back at Halverson and Trent with a full caseload that included a new client assignment, a regional manufacturing company called Drexler Components, whose financial statements had not been audited in 2 years, and whose books required the kind of systematic attention that I find genuinely satisfying in the way that problems with solutions satisfy me. My supervising partner, a methodical man named Warren Fisk, told me at the assignment meeting that the Drexler work would be the most complex engagement I had managed independently and that he had given it to me because complexity was where I was most useful. I said I understood and that I would have a preliminary assessment to him by the following Friday. I had it to him by Thursday. In April, my father convened a second family financial meeting. This one was different from the first. There was no document prepared in advance. There was no presentation. My father sat at the head of the table, his own table in his own kitchen, and said that he wanted to talk about what a fair arrangement looked like, and that he thought fair meant everyone in the room had to be honest about what they could actually contribute and what they actually needed. Chisholm was there. He was quieter than I had ever seen him at a family gathering. His wife Adana had come with him, which she had not done before, and she sat beside him with a notepad. We talked for 2 hours. At the end of it, we had a structure that was different from anything that had existed before, a smaller account, a defined contribution from each member scaled to income, a quarterly summary distributed to every participant, and an explicit agreement that the account was for genuine family emergencies and not for individual expenses that fell under anyone's personal budget. Chisholm's contribution, under the new structure, was $400 a month. He did not contest it, which told me that the conversation with Adana had covered ground that I had not been present for. My contribution was $300 a month. My father's was $250. Tabena's was $100, with the understanding that it would increase when he finished his degree. I went to the bank the following week and added myself to the new account, a different account, at a different bank, with all 4 contributors on the signature card. I was not the sole authorized signer this time. There is a version of this story where I tell you that removing my name from the account was a power move, a strategic decision, the first step in a plan. It was not. It was a conclusion. I had been looking at the spreadsheet for months before Thanksgiving. I had been in the arrangement for 5 years before that. What Thanksgiving did was not create a decision. It confirmed one I had already made, the way a final piece of evidence confirms a conclusion you have been approaching for a long time. I am 29 years old. I am a CPA at a firm where the supervising partner tells me that complexity is where I am most useful, which is the most accurate professional description I have received. I have a savings account with $41,000 in it. I have an account I contribute to every month with 3 other people on terms that everyone agreed to out loud, with numbers attached. I have a grandmother who held my hand for a moment at the end of a Thanksgiving table and did not let go until I was ready to leave. The arrangement is not perfect. My uncle's adjustments are newer than his habits, and new things take longer to become habits than old things take to become assumptions. My father is still learning to look at the mechanics of things he has decided are working. My brother is 3 semesters from a degree that will change his options, and I am watching that happen with the particular attention of someone who knows what options look like when they compound. What I know that I did not know 5 years ago, when I sat at my parents' kitchen table and read a 3-page document with my contribution amount at the top. The word family is not a financial instrument. It can be used like one, and it often is, but that use is a category error. What makes a family work is not the pooling. It is the honesty about who is doing what and whether that is what everyone agreed to. That honesty is harder than the pooling. It is also the only thing that holds. What you call yours is worth naming clearly before someone else names it for you. For 5 years, I was the authorized signer on a joint account I had been the primary funder of, in an arrangement that had been designed at a family meeting and had drifted, year by year, into something that looked like pooling and functioned like extraction. 11 days before Thanksgiving, I went to the bank and removed my name. At the table, when my uncle said, "In this family we pool," I kissed my grandmother's cheek and said goodnight. In January, the statements arrived, and the balance told its own story. By April, we had a new account, for contributors, a quarterly summary, and numbers everyone had agreed to out loud. Here is what I keep coming back to. At that January meeting, when I set the summary page on the table and my uncle's hand went still on the edge of the paper, there was a moment before anyone spoke where every person in that room was reading the same document for the first time. I had read it many times. They were reading it once. I have wondered since whether what my uncle saw in that first reading was the number beside his name, or the number beside mine, or whether he was doing the subtraction between the two and arriving somewhere he had not expected to be. If you have ever been the person who brought the document to the table, who already knew what it said while the room read it for the first time, what did you do with the silence while they caught up? Share this with someone who has been the authorized signer on something they never agreed to in those words. And if this story found you where you needed it, subscribe because there are more where this one came from. This is an original fictional story created for entertainment purposes only. All names, characters, events, and financial details are invented and do not represent real individuals or occurrences.